This is Duke University.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around this afternoon. It's great to see faces still in the crowd. I'm Frances Selema. I'm with the U.S. Department of Commerce, based here out of Raleigh. I am part of Walter Bastian's group, who was just speaking earlier, but just as a bit of background, based here in Raleigh, our office works, is a federal office. We've got a couple of offices here in North Carolina and work directly with North Carolina exporters to help open the doors for global opportunity. So there's been a really great discussion about NAFTA today, and what we wanted to do for this session was really break it down on a state level. So what are the implications for NAFTA in North Carolina? What are the trends? What's happening trade-wise? And then on a research level, what are the industrial development trends and how has it affected wages in North Carolina? And I'm very honored to be sitting on this panel with two true leaders in the state of North Carolina in this realm. And I think both of them come without formal introduction, but I'll do it anyway. At the end of the table here is Gene Davis, and truly a leader in North Carolina in economic development and international trade. And just recently went to the private sector from North Carolina Department of Commerce and International Trade Division, and had a great opportunity to work alongside her as partners here in the state of North Carolina. And then before her work with the state, she had her own business and was involved very heavily in international trade. And then Dr. Gary Gereffi, he's a member of you guys here at Duke. He's also got some other big names under his belt, like Notre Dame and Yale. So a very bright guy, and we would be here all day if we went down the list of the books that he's published or contributed to, or the papers that he's written. So I'll allow you to read it all in your guide, but he truly is a pioneer in research of the global community chain and the global value chain. So I think what we'll do here is we'll start with Gene to talk about just sort of some of the industry trends and whatnot, and then bring it over to Gary for some more on the research side.
Thanks, Gene. Frances. Great. So as you can imagine, my slide deck that was 20 slides this morning is now about 4 slides because you've talked about the aerospace supply chain in Mexico. You've talked about all the things that I was going to talk about. So let me just hit some high points as far as North Carolina goes. So we're talking about our top 2 list here. Canada being our #1 trading partner, Mexico being our #2 trading partner. Javier pointed out that we got concerned when China jumped up to #2 and started to think that some of our relationships were changing. But the resurgence of the Mexican economy, a lot of the emerging industries there that match up really well with North Carolina have allowed us to have Mexico move back up to our #2 trading partner, which means a lot to us because we have so many ties with Mexico and with Canada. So when you think about North Carolina, we're a state of almost 10 million people, and in 2013, we exported almost $30 billion worth of products and services around the world to 214 global markets. And that's really saying something for a state like this. We have converted our state from our traditional industries of textiles and tobacco and furniture into this global knowledge economy. And that's been a wonderful thing for our state through our research universities like Duke and Chapel Hill. But that's also created some gaps in our state that I'll talk about a little bit later. So you've heard $6.7 billion to Canada, $2.7 billion to Mexico. Amazing numbers. Javier mentioned that we have had our offices, we've had 8 overseas offices for many years, and I will say that through the ups and downs of state budgets, through the changing of guard from Republicans to Democrats, we have always had great legislative support for our international collaboration offices around the world, and that's so important. I remember in 2009, I was in Shanghai opening our office there. We have had an office in Hong Kong for 25 years. And they said to me, you're in this for the long haul? And I was like, as much as I could guarantee anything in this world. And they said, because California came to China, opened an office, and then 2 years later, they shut it down. And, we didn't give them a permit the next time they wanted to come back. So, I mean, the consistency and relationships and business that happen on a frequent basis are so important in global business. And so we've been a great state for that kind of global engagement. And so what do we have going to Canada and Mexico from North Carolina? Many of the things you can imagine, traditional things like machinery, chemicals, transportation equipment, computers and electronics. And when I think about the shows that we do in Canada, so our department, the Department of Commerce, North Carolina, takes North Carolina companies up to Canada to introduce them to buyers and resellers and get an idea of what's going on in the market. And last year, we were at the Oil and Gas Show in Canada, introducing our companies to opportunities in the Calgary oil sands. We were at a manufacturing equipment trade show up there, had great success, at a furniture show and at a food show where we had a Flavors of Carolina event at the food show. And so, again, Canada remains one of our biggest trading partners and a lot of great opportunities. Mexico has also been an amazing partner for us. Some of the things that we export to Mexico are similar. Again, machinery, textile and fabrics, plastic and rubber products. And some of the success we had last year in Mexico were at Exintec. So you heard Gary speak earlier about fiber physics and the idea of high-performance non-woven fibers that are so in the forefront of their industry, and so had great success in Mexico around those high-performance fibers. Also renewable energy. So we had about 8 North Carolina companies down at a renewable energy show in Mexico, and they had great success in some commercial applications and other things there. And then obviously a lot going on in aerospace. As I mentioned, we have a burgeoning aerospace cluster here in North Carolina with Spirit Aero making the fuselage and wing spar for Airbus in Europe, Timco Aviation in Greensboro doing MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul, and lots of supply chain companies in the middle of that aerospace cluster. And that really is something that stretches from Canada into North Carolina and down to Mexico. So lots of emerging industry targets in Mexico. And I think that, there's been a lot of discussion today about crime in Mexico, and, of course, the newspapers have lots of different things about places around the world, and for all of us who've had the chance to travel into Mexico, and for our companies, what they've really seen are opportunities there. And our companies have been very successful. The companies that have built relationships via our contacts in the consulate and embassy have been very successful in Mexico and have had, truthfully no problems that we've encountered. So, why are exports so important to North Carolina? Exports support so many jobs in North Carolina. The last count we had were 1.2 million jobs in North Carolina are supported via international trade. So very important. That's all the supply chain, the ports, the trains, all the things that go into producing and exporting a product. Our challenge in North Carolina, like in so many states, is that we just don't have enough companies exporting. So some of the national statistics that you've heard are awful, about 1% of companies exporting and that sort of thing. We think that through the President's National Export Initiative that we've moved that needle quite a bit, but still a real challenge. And again, most of the companies that Frances' team and my old team work with are small and medium-sized companies that for many of these people, they're worried about payroll today and how do I just get through the day. And so they need a lot of help and a lot of hand-holding when it comes to exporting even to Mexico and Canada. And so there's usually 2 markets that we start with. Because of NAFTA, ease of entry, lots of great relationships that have been there for a long time, easy to find a good partner, et cetera. And so always a place that we start, Canada and Mexico. So our chart for North Carolina exports is going straight up. So for the past 5 years, exports from North Carolina out have increased $2 billion each year. And so constantly seeing that graph and chart move up. And so thinking about NAFTA and North Carolina, Obviously, you know, when NAFTA went into play in 1994, we had a lot of our traditional industries that had great concerns and who did their best to talk with our federal counterparts about how to address their issues. To this day, we continue through our relationship with the Federal Department of Commerce to always be talking to our companies about the barriers to entry that they face, be it tariffs or non-tariff trade barriers, you know, whatever it is, you know, continually feeding that information up into DC so that as these new free trade agreements come into play, that the folks negotiating these have an understanding of what's affecting businesses, small businesses in places like North Carolina. And so, you know, when you look at the numbers of how manufacturing jobs have suffered since NAFTA, the numbers can look a little grim. You know, it's always hard to, you know, fully, when you look at various policy pieces around free trade, you're going to get lots of different numbers around that. And so I would say that between some of the issues that NAFTA brought on board, but probably more importantly, the maturity of the market, the maturity of those industries, the global slowdown, that all of those things are put together and looking at manufacturing job loss. Also in North Carolina, we had a high concentration of the very specific industries that are generally affected by these kind of things. And so I think that was one of the reasons that we suffered a bit more than others. You know, what that's also highlighted to us is this rural-urban split that we have in North Carolina, something that we continue to try to address. You know, when we look at our job growth numbers in 2013, you will see that most of the job growth in North Carolina was solely focused on the region around Raleigh and the region around Charlotte. So that's where all the job creation came from. And so again, what does that mean for the rest of our states and some of the traditional industries that were there? And of course, productivity gains in manufacturing, another important point of that. North Carolina was ranked of the top 10 manufacturing states, #1 in the productivity index. So the productivity of our companies is very high, and of course that benefit plays itself out in having less workers in there. Another thing I want to point out specifically about North Carolina is that we are very lucky to have an international legislative caucus inside of our General Assembly. And what that's all about is trying to educate our politicians around you know, why global trade is so important to their regions, to the state as a whole. And so I remember taking some legislators down to Mexico and bringing them into a textile manufacturing facility. And, you know, this was before all the new freshman legislators came, and this were some of the older politicians in the state. And when they walked around that facility and got an understanding of that there were two people on that factory floor, two software engineers who were running an automated thread spinning facility. You know, it is not, the current textile manufacturing industry in Mexico or anywhere else is an automated industry. It is not the textile industry of the past. And so I think sometimes people forget what that's all about. And interestingly enough, last night when I was standing with Roberta, she was talking about some of her questions and issues and opportunities that have been coming up as she's been traveling around in Central and South America. And what she said to me was, these folks are starting to get freaked out because now all of their textile and other low-end manufacturing is leaving, and they don't know how to prepare for what's next. And so, you know, it's that age-old concept of moving from England to New England to the South to Mexico and then on from there. And so again, you know, we'll all have to struggle with those kind of issues, and it's an interesting thing to contemplate. So, you know, what have been the real opportunities with NAFTA here for North Carolinians? Clearly, the increase in trade. But also the increase with that trade, obviously, we think a lot about investment following trade. And so because of the trade relationship via NAFTA with Canada and Mexico, we've certainly seen a great increase in Canadian companies and Mexican companies coming here to North Carolina to set up shop. And so there's folks like Linamar that you've heard of, a Canadian company that continues to expand President Obama was with Linamar out near Charlotte last year. They make automotive components. And then a company like Dax America, a Mexican company that makes very high-tech resins for industrial uses. For many of our North Carolina companies, lower raw material input costs for their products. And for all of us that are out talking to companies, during this tough economic time in the U.S., exports have really been the bright spot. And when, 7 years ago when I joined Commerce, and we would go out and talk to people about international trade, they would say, don't come to our town and talk to us about international trade because that means our jobs are going away. And in the 7 years that I've been here, that conversation has shifted completely to where people really understand the benefits of international trade, the benefits of NAFTA for them, and the opportunities that it creates for them. And so that's been a really heartening thing for all of us. And a few other things. So if you can imagine, 2 years ago, we opened up a new shipping line between the Port of Wilmington and the Port of Cortez in Honduras. And now we ship more yarn and thread into Central America than we do to China. And so I think that some of these shifts with logistics and technology are changing things for North Carolina. The other thing we know about free trade agreements is that, I think the statistic is that our free trade partners purchase 12.2 times more product from us than our non-FTA partners. And so a pretty simple math equation around how free trade agreements happen. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here with just a little bit of a talk to talk a little bit about NAFTA in relation to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and also to TTIP, the European Trade Agreement. So Canada and Mexico came into TPP in 2012. And I think there's, trying to, between the Trans-Pacific and Europe, I think there's a lot of different feelings. Javier could tell me better what the Mexicans think about our possible relationship with Europe via the TTIP. But when you think about it, NAFTA is the core of TPP. 68% of the combined output and 60% of the population. So clearly, just incredibly linked, and we've got to figure this out for all of us if we're going to move forward. Obviously, the Trans-Pacific would generate significant income and trade gains for each of the countries. The Trans-Pacific Partnership will update and augment NAFTA without renegotiating NAFTA, which is of interest to a lot of people. And the regional rules of origin will better help to integrate North American firms in the global supply chain. And so those are some of the things that we've been thinking about and talking to people too and advising around these free trade agreements coming out. So I'm going to stop there and let Gary jump in. And at Commerce, we have really relied on Gary and his team for this kind of research and industry cluster studies and just, amazing work that you do, and we appreciate it so much.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Jean. I think we'll, again, allow Gary to go, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Okay, good afternoon. And again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to all the organizers and especially Jane, who's done a lot of the heavy work, and Patrick. I really like the title of the conference, NAFTA at 20, but I think I like the subtitle more, The Future of North American Competitiveness, because I really think that is the topic around which researchers, firms, policymakers are trying to come together to think, what does that actually mean? And I know from the researcher perspective, this has become a very striking trend, the idea of regional competitiveness as the right level at which to think about it. If we go back to about 1970, the kind of the pre-globalization era, even in 1970, the world economy was largely made up of national economies that made most of what they sold in their country and traded relatively little with each other. So back around 1970, I think only about 10% of consumption in the US were from imports. The other 90% were from goods that we made in the United States. And then beginning in the 70s and all the way through to the present, through into the 2000s, is this process of economic globalization where firms started to move offshore, first to nearby countries and then all around the world in search of lower labor cost and access to new markets and critical materials, so that by 2010, you could look around and a whole set of products, zero production in the US of what we consume. Televisions, one of the favorite industries of Jorge Carrillo. Cell phones, bicycles, athletic footwear. There's virtually zero production in the US, and these are huge consumer items, as we know, just looking around. So we've gone from national economies being the focal point to these global supply chains where much of what's manufactured in the world is done in less developed countries. The last 5 years, 5 to 8 years, and I guess the economic recession of 2008, 2009 is a very distinct turning point. This has changed a lot. And for a variety of reasons, which I won't elaborate now, there has been this move against hyperglobalization back to regionalization, or the idea that regional supply chains are actually a more stable base from which to build national competitiveness than fragmented global supply chains. And I think North America is a great example of it. Gary Huffbauer, in one of his slides, was telling us, well, there's 4 main regions of the world. And he talked about North America and EU, and then he had China and Russia. I would say you could actually take the China piece and turn that into East Asia. When you look at China's exports of all the different manufactured goods and take the classic iPhone example that we hear about, China assembles and exports the vast majority of iPhones that we consume in the US, and iPods and iPads and other things. But the production of those goods, the assembly of those goods, comes from a regional ecosystem of strong electronics industries in Singapore and South Korea and Taiwan, et cetera. So the main point is nowadays, regions are competing with regions. And the question is, if that's the way competitiveness is being defined, how do we strengthen something like North American competitiveness? And so I want to talk about that, and I want to give 3 examples because it is something that the researchers who have been looking at things like global value chains are paying a lot of attention to. We're doing a project right now with in Africa with something called the International Growth Center with Oxford and London School of Economics. And they don't want Africa, they want East Africa, 4 countries in East Africa that together are forming a bloc. And we're doing work in different regions of the world. So the 3 examples, I want to talk about regional value chains in North America, but with a focus on Mexico, a particular study that a combined group of sort of researchers, including Jorge Carrillo and people at my Center on Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness here at Duke, we're helping to design with the Inter-American Development Bank and the Mexican government. Then I want to talk a little bit about a North Carolina and the global economy project that we've had here at Duke and sort of say why that North Carolina focus. And then I want to give a final example about an analysis of North Carolina's manufacturing wage gap, which I did with Aaron Sider, a Canadian economist who spent last year at our Duke Center and he wants to also understand how subnational units, provinces in Canada and states in the US actually can link up more effectively. So let me first talk about this value chain project in Mexico. So the researchers that have been looking at these global value chains or global supply chains increasingly are realizing, and it's been out there in the literature, that if we're talking about international competitiveness, we really have to link 4 separate levels of analysis. Today, when we've been hearing a lot of the comments about North America, we've heard a lot about 3 countries, US, Mexico, Canada, and it makes sense to kind of focus at that national level. But once you start getting into specific industries like the automobile industry, or the medical devices industry, or the aerospace industry, in each of those 3 countries where those industries are all strong, the part of those countries where the industries are located are different. as we can imagine. So part of what we begin to realize is once we start focusing on different industries, and that's kind of been a hallmark of a lot of this academic research on global supply chains, global value chains, is an industry focus is very important. You have to look at global industries, figure out which countries are major competitors in those global industries. And then within those countries, you have to figure out which places, which clusters have been the focal points for production. So our challenge is how do you link the local, the national, the regional, in this case North American, and the global. And I think this focus on global supply chains has been really, really useful because it's very firm-centered. When everybody talks about economies or markets, they really know you're talking about firms, but firms that in today's environment are linked in these global supply chains. And so understanding how those supply chains work, how they're organized, becomes a really important part of the research. So in Mexico, the current administration in Mexico has a national development plan for the next 6 years, 2013 to 2018. And in this national development plan, they've got 3 types of sectors or 3 clusters of industries. Some of the industries they're talking about as mature, or other people might call them traditional industries, like textiles and apparel, machinery, clothing, footwear, food. So that's one set. Another set of industries would be the more dynamic industries, automotive and auto parts, which is one of the biggest industries, probably from the region's point of view, the single biggest industry. Between US, Mexico, Canada, the automotive sector is enormously important. Medical devices would also be important, but it includes aerospace, electrical, electronic, et cetera. And then there's a new set of emerging industries like medical devices that are more high tech. But the point of this Mexican program is over the next 6 years, Mexico wants to identify anywhere between 20 and 25 different industries. And then they want to analyze them in order to say, how is it that Mexico can make itself more competitive in each of those sectors? They clearly understand that because 85% of Mexico's trade goes with the US, that in order to understand the industries in Mexico, they have to be able to link them to what's going on in the US, and in many cases also to Canada. So partly what we're doing, so the premise of this plan, the Mexican government, Secretary of the Economy, is working together with the Inter-American Development Bank. They're creating a $50 million 5-year loan package that would be used to help Mexico implement this economic development plan. And Mexico is also sometimes called innovating development, desarrollo innovador. So they're really trying to think about improving Mexican competitiveness, but really moving up the value chain. And they have 3 focuses. One focus is understanding these industries as global value chains. Second, looking at the particular clusters or places in Mexico in each chain where production is going on. And the third topic is internationalization of Mexican firms, by which they mean export promotion. So it's a totally sensible strategy. They've asked us to do kind of 3 pilot studies to show how would you actually do this kind of research at the multiple levels that I mentioned. So we're going to work with them on textiles and apparel, which is a traditional industry and it's very strong, of course, in the US and Mexico, a bit in Canada, aerospace and medical devices. So we're covering the 3 levels of development, but I just want to illustrate with 2 slides why it's so important to link the subnational clusters or have those very apparent when we are doing this kind of a research project. So this is a map of the aerospace or aeronautics industry in Mexico. And as you can see there, there's a lot of different regions in Mexico that are producing parts or modules, sub-assemblies for the aerospace industry. In those different regions, we can find out which companies are located in those regions. But what it means is that there's sort of distinctive places in Mexico. But if you look at this from a global supply chain or global value chain perspective, one of the important characteristics of this is different regions have different possibilities for economic development. So if you go to Querétaro, which is where somebody mentioned this morning, Bombardier has a big plant. So the Canadian aircraft company is in Mexico, and they've got a lot of assemblers, Mexican companies and international companies, producing parts for Bombardier. Well, that's a very advanced manufacturing kind of high-tech cluster. But if you go to Baja California, where there's another very big group of firms, they're mainly making parts for the aerospace industry. And they're not just producing for Bombardier, they're producing for Airbus, and they're producing for Boeing. And those tend to be much more labor intensive. So if you just look at those two clusters, and then you're trying to figure out, so what's Mexico's potential in the aerospace industry? Well, we have to piece together 6 or 7 different production centers in Mexico to try to figure out what Mexico's capabilities is in terms of the broader aerospace supply chain. But then we also want to know, well, how are those places linked to what's going on in the US or what's going on in Canada? How are they linked to Boeing in Seattle as well as Bombardier in Canada? So you can see that immediately, because Mexico's production is especially in these advanced industries, very export-oriented, we need to know about those export markets. We don't need to know just what country they go to. We need to know which firms in those countries are buying the parts that Mexico's making, because that really helps us understand Mexico's opportunity to move up the value chain. Let me just show the same slide that Jorge showed earlier on the automobile industry, which highlights that automobiles is actually spreads across all 3 countries in North America. I remember about 6 years ago, Industry Canada asked us to do a study on Canada's auto parts sector, basically concentrated on Ontario. And the concern that Canada had was we've got a really strong auto parts sector, a lot of advanced manufacturing, but we don't have any big automobile assemblers in Canada. We don't have GM, we don't have Ford, we don't have Toyota, we don't have Volkswagen. So the question was, and we export, Canada exports largely to the US, and they were already very, very aware of the supply chain question. Because when they say, when we export to the US, we export primarily to American assemblers in the US. But when we look at the other half of the US automobile industry, the European and Japanese and Korean companies, we don't export to those supply chains very much. They're much more localized. So already Canada was beginning to think that the future of its auto parts industry is going to be told partly by how the supply chains in the US source goods from Canada and Mexico. And so in this kind of a project, we kind of have to do the same thing. We have to know, in Mexico's case, they've got big clusters around Ford and Hermosillo, and around Volkswagen and Puebla, and around Nissan and other multinationals. Each of them has different capabilities. And if you go to Ciudad Juarez, where Delphi is, they've got a lot of high-tech production that collaborates with what's going on in Indiana. So the point of this is, if we're going to understand the future of Mexico's economy in terms of upgrading potential, we absolutely need to have these kind of maps that help us link not just Mexico, US, Canada, but the parts of Mexico, US, and Canada that are involved in each of these industries. So this is showing that Mexico clearly gets it. They want to move ahead, and they want to do it with an integrated research team, and Walter mentioned this point about capability building. Mexico's saying, look, over 5 years, we want to develop the capacity in Mexico to have our researchers and international research teams help figure this out. We need to analyze every industry with these kinds of ideas in mind. So this is kind of how Mexico's approaching it. So let me kind of give us 2 examples on North Carolina, which will bring us back to the panel and some of the things Jean was mentioning. In talking to students about global competitiveness, I was always a bit reluctant to use examples of what's happening in Taiwan or Vietnam or even Mexico, places that students couldn't relate to because it's not present. So thinking more about the fact that whenever I've talked to global companies and they say what countries they locate in, they really say country first, and then very quickly it's what city, what state within the country. And so it's the idea that North Carolina, with 10 million people, the 10th largest state by area in the US, we're about as big as 3/4 of the countries of the world, or bigger. That in fact, we could do the same kind of global value chain analysis at the state level. Because North Carolina, like other states, they have often very proactive leadership, especially when in places like the Department of Commerce or certain governors or whatever, who are out there recruiting foreign investment. And they're trying to recruit investment to come into the state to match what our core competence is. And so in North Carolina, about 7 10 years ago, I started to create a website called North Carolina and the Global Economy that looked at some of our major industries in the state in terms of how we were affected by globalization, especially looking at jobs. And we took several of the traditional industries, tobacco, textiles and apparel, furniture, where North Carolina was the #1 producing state in the country for many years, but they've been very hard hit by globalization, lots of job loss. And we took some high-tech sectors like information technology, biotechnology, banks and finance, where North Carolina has a different kind of a picture. And we've created a website. On that website, we have lots of information for every one of those industries. We're able to track who all the major companies are in North Carolina. And we can do it at a county level because you can use databases that say for a company, what's its zip code. So we can tell in a map like the one on the left for the textiles and apparel, if the county is shaded dark, it's got more jobs. If it's shaded light, it's got less jobs. So over 10 years, what's happening to some of these industries? Some of them are losing jobs. Counties within the state are finding that certain industries are leaving, like furniture or textiles, and in other industries like IT or biotech, they're growing. So it seemed like it was a really useful tool. But one of the things we've done more recently is we wanted to go from creating a supply chain, let's say, for the furniture industry, where in North Carolina furniture, we could build a value chain that would say, you have inputs, you have production, distribution, and we could create these boxes and arrows that say, what are the different activities that go into the furniture industry? But what's really nice about North American cases is we have this information system called NAICS, North American Industrial Classification System, that allows us to put product codes inside each of the parts of a supply chain so we can say how many firms, how many jobs, what's the average wage in North Carolina in the furniture industry. So we can do a much more detailed assessment of where the state is gaining or losing jobs, where we're gaining or losing firms. So this has kind of been up on the Duke website, on our center website for a number of years, but we've updated it recently. It's 20 years worth of data. But still, this is kind of a supply side researcher vision. Like, this information is useful. We want to make it visually easy to access, but you still have to try to find ways to motivate people to use it. And the question is whether it's firms or whether it's policymakers. And so one of the things we started to do is we said, if we can actually show how many jobs there are in furniture in North Carolina, we can do it for any state in the US, and we can do it for any state in Mexico, and we can do it for any province in Canada. So we started this last go-round to actually take North Carolina for every one of those industries and say, well, which are the 5 states that North Carolina most competes with? And that's where we start getting into the importance of subnational spaces, as Jorge Carrillo was mentioning earlier, or these interstate comparisons. So if we take furniture, in this case, North Carolina, and we look at it in terms of employment, North Carolina is the #1 state in the country so far in terms of employment, followed by California, Texas, Indiana, Michigan, Mississippi. And when you're doing these kind of industry studies, it's important to kind of divide the industry into segments. So in furniture, the 2 biggest segments, household and office. So household furniture is what North Carolina does best. That's wooden furniture that's also upholstered. So North Carolina also takes advantage of its textile industry to do that. But if you look at Michigan, Michigan actually does office furniture, much more. So you have to say, who are you really competing with? So this was unemployment, but we did the same chart for wages. And we said, well, when you look at wages, actually North Carolina comes much further down on the list. We're number 5 there. Our average wage for household furniture, let's say, is $42,500. For for furniture, about $36,000 for office furniture, $33,000 for household, et cetera. We compare ourselves to Michigan. Michigan's earning a lot more money in the same segments. So the question then for North Carolina, if we're taking a state level, how could we earn higher wages? How could we get into higher value niches of even a declining industry like furniture? So the website kind of allows us, or this kind of a framework, allows us to start to compare what we're doing in North Carolina, industry by industry, with other states, and how we can actually turn that into a comparative advantage. So the final example I want to give, and then we'll just open it up, is how we could take this particular approach and turn it to a specific question that Aaron Sider was interested in when he was comparing North Carolina with Canadian provinces. And this is this issue of North Carolina's manufacturing wage gap. Somebody earlier in the day mentioned, if we look at manufacturing as a share of GDP, the US average is something like 11%. So 11% of our GDP comes from manufacturing. But in North Carolina, it's close to 20%. And North Carolina has always been known as a state that makes things, even in nanotechnology, which is an area that North Carolina has invested a lot. We've put our emphasis in nano manufacturing, not the R&D, not the marketing or product development. So we've been known as a manufacturing state, and when Aaron was doing this analysis using much more detailed kind of input-output statistics, he discovered that North Carolina's manufacturing wage is about $8,000 less than the national average. So our wage is around $44,000 per year per job. National average is around $52,000. So when I showed this, there's an analysis behind it. The first question people said was, well, is this a good thing or a bad thing? If we say we're $8,000 lower than other states, then some people say, great, that's a competitive edge. People will come to North Carolina to make things because it's less expensive, but if you're equally productive, you come out ahead. And so we really wanted to try to dissect this question, and we ended up saying, of that $8,000 manufacturing wage gap, there's really two major sources. One, in similar jobs, North Carolina's wages are lower for a variety of reasons, including we don't have unions, and we are further south, lower cost of living. So that's one possibility, just we pay less in the same jobs. But another, even more important factor is the composition of our industries. In North Carolina's manufacturing sector, do we have more industries that on general pay lower wages compared to higher wage paying industries? So we call that the composition effect and the wage effect. And we find that in fact, it's about half and half. About half of the reason why we have a lower wage is because for similar jobs, North Carolina's wage structure is lower. But the other half is because we tend not to have as many high-paying, high-technology industries. So from a state development point of view, part of what we would want to do to close that wage gap is to get more high-tech industries in North Carolina. Or in the industries we do have, like furniture and textiles, move up the value chain to higher technology kinds of end products. And so we were doing this kind of an analysis. One other thing we noticed is if you look at this in these industry categories, let's call them 4-digit NAICS codes, but for particular products, we also discovered that North Carolina has no industry where the average wage is $75,000 or more. Most of our industries are in these lower wage areas, 25 to 35,000, 35 to 45,000. So partly this reinforces the idea that North Carolina's traditional strength in manufacturing has been more labor-intensive, low-tech industries like textiles, and especially apparel and furniture. So the growth opportunities could be in the high-tech industries. And this is my sort of next to last slide. But the issue from a researcher point of view, but thinking about it from like Jean's office when she was at North Carolina, is how would we turn an analysis of North Carolina's industries into upgrading strategies for the state? In other words, how does when I was talking to people at North Carolina Department of Commerce, what they would often say is the big gains for the Department of Commerce is investment attraction. You go out and you try to find big companies to come in, find that big auto assembler, find an aircraft maker, find Dell or whomever it is. But in order to recruit firms, you have to be able to show the firms what their fit is in the state and why coming to North Carolina makes more sense than going to another rival state. So what we ended up doing was we took the different industries that North Carolina has and we divided them into low wage, high wage in terms of national averages, and industries where North Carolina would have relatively low employment compared to the national average or high employment. So the top right cell here are industries where North Carolina's not very strong, our employment is less than the national average, and their wages are less than the national average. So the right column are low-wage industries, and that's the least interesting area for North Carolina. Those are kind of the least desirable jobs. But if you look in the lower right, low-wage, high employment, those are all industries where North Carolina's traditionally been strong. Textiles and furniture are two big ones there. And then the question is, if you wanted to improve North Carolina's economic performance, one thing you can do is take those traditional industries and move to higher value products. Two quick examples, furniture. The furniture industry has been getting lots of international requests, especially from Asia, for customized high-end American-made furniture from North Carolina with North Carolina brands. They'd come back and say, well, we're getting all these orders. Now we've got to ramp up production because the furniture industry left years ago. And all of a sudden they're discovering you can't just do that. You can't take industries where you've lost your managers, you've lost your workforce, and then all of a sudden you want to try to scale up. But there is a market for high-end furniture, and even more in textiles. The example that was brought up earlier, it's true. NC State's College of Textiles is probably the premier place in the country, and we've been developing all kinds of high-tech textiles, not for the apparel industry, not even for automotive, but for things like the medical industry, antimicrobial fabrics. The skin on aircraft is made from high-tech textiles, the defense industry. So there's a whole lot of high-paying, high-tech new end markets for U.S. textiles, especially for North American textiles. So if you're thinking about what's the upgrading strategy, you could take some of these traditional products and look for new markets. I think the lower left, they pay high wages. We already have a high employment. The pharmaceutical industry is a big one here in Research Triangle. A lot of those companies are saying, well, the future of pharmaceutical is biopharma. We have to go from pharmaceuticals and link it with things like nanotechnology. They want to know whether they should expand their North Carolina plants or expand their New Jersey plants or expand the plants in the UK. So there it's a different kind of an upgrading strategy. You want to take firms you have and you want to convince them that they should be going to the high-tech industries. We're doing something on the defense sector with a Duke class, and we found out that the office in the US military to procure everything that a soldier wears, they moved it from Atlanta to Raleigh, Durham because of Research Triangle Park, because they think high tech is really important. And then finally, that upper one, that's aerospace, that's motor vehicles, that's semiconductors. Those would be the really super desirable industries that we don't have yet in strong clusters, although they pay high wages and they would be really great growth industries. So, and aerospace is a really important one here. That's, in Mexico, somebody had made, maybe it was Antonio said that Mexico has 200 aerospace companies, and Jorge Carrillo said actually it's 470 aerospace companies. North Carolina has a lot of aerospace production, but it's not well unified as a cluster. So the point of this is we can take a state focus, North Carolina. We can look at North Carolina in a regional North American context, and we can do this kind of industry analysis that would actually feed into a development strategy for the state. It means you've got to have government leadership in part, and unfortunately, I think we've lost many of our best people, but I think North Carolina historically has had strong leadership, and I hope we can return to that. And you also need to bring firms into the discussion. And I know that firms are they think along these lines, and they are very interested in which state they should be locating in. So maybe let me end there and say that I think that researchers working together with policymakers and with companies are starting to develop the tools that will allow us to take a notion like North American competitiveness and really ground it in state-level analysis that also could play into national and regional strategies for improving the performance of these different industries. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Gary. That was some pretty interesting stuff. I see why your expertise is so highly sought after. I think we've got a little bit of time for questions, about 10 minutes, is that right? Here.
This is really something for Gene. I want to get back to services. If you look at the services that North Carolina has that they export to other states, and this is, I don't have the data on this, but I think I'm probably pretty close. I can think of 3 of them that are really important. Tourism, medical services and education. And if you go to the last two, Duke University has a pretty coherent long-range strategy for creating business in these areas. For example, they offer very big summer camps for gifted students, which pay their own way, but they also get gifted students to want to apply to Duke. The hospital has been buying up medical practices all over North Carolina, so they get referrals to Duke. And I'm just wondering if your office has a strategy for promoting this kind of thing, which creates a tremendous amount of good jobs.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, we've talked a lot about this because, I mean, the bad data that we have, be it what it is, shows that services, for example, are our fastest growing export, period, in the state, in the country, period. So yes, I mean, we've had a tough time struggling, talking with the feds about how we track service exports. I mean, in North Carolina, for example, we've got architects and engineers designing city blocks in Shanghai. We've got pharmaceutical engineers designing GMP facilities in Brazil. You know, I mean, when you have a knowledge economy and that's what you have on offer, it clearly is a key part of our economy. You know, I think that we probably approach it in a couple different ways. So, you know, one of our big industries here in North Carolina is financial services. So Charlotte is the second largest banking center, financial services center after New York. And so while we can measure those jobs here in North Carolina and talk about the brain power and the assets and the research going on in our universities around those different industries, we can measure that within the state. But in terms of really addressing it as an industry sector, I would say that we have not done the best job around that and have not, you know, highlighted that, other than to say that, you know, because of our research university, because of our high per capita population of PhDs, because of our research universities, all these things, we're a perfect place for services, medical, financial. But no, we haven't really, I think, highlighted that as a real strategy around services. And certainly when it comes to exports, you know, they're very difficult to measure. And, you know, we've had a tough time with data. So, for example, one of the ways that we access data for international trade is through the PIERS system. Now, originally that was just waterborne shipments, so we couldn't even measure trucking to Mexico. Now the data is much more integrated, but still when it comes to services, I mean, you've got a high-value product going on an airplane off in a FedEx box to Germany or to Singapore, and so tracking that really is hard and measuring that, but clearly one of the really important things in our economy, both domestic and international. Yep, need to work on that.
Thank you. I have just a comment because this is the last panel, and I think you did a great job, the panelists. Thank you so much on putting together this some sort of dysfunctional discourse that we were having. Right, we were talking about NAFTA as a political fix. We heard that. We were hearing also that NAFTA was just a business operation and ruled by business people at one point, and then government came last. And then also calls from academia as an important player within this nexus. And then here we have, right, finally, three things put together as well needed, right? And then thank you so much, Professor Gereffi, for that, because finally we are in agreement. But I also have a question. We're talking about economics, right, in general, right? And in economics, in the basic economics, we also talk about people, right? Let's say, quote unquote, consumers. But there is an absence of that last part, right? Or on the side of consumers and people. We talk about trade, about products, about exports, imports, but we don't talk about people. I mean, jobs probably, yes, but there is some sort of lacking on that dimension, right? It's life, quality of life, issues of mobility. Okay, we're here. But it's a comment also, an open comment, to introduce again into the economics that dimension. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question?
Yes. Yes, I have a question, I guess, more for Gary. I found your presentation fascinating, but each time I sort of get into that issue, I have new answers and then new questions. So in terms of that, in your 2x2 diagram, you state how you might want to move into some industries, high value added, higher wages. But I have the first question is how you would do that, right? I assume that if you did a similar research for another region, the picture might not be too dissimilar, and maybe everyone will want to have an aerospace hub, and given economies of scale, not everyone can have an aerospace hub. So that's that consideration. And then secondly, what role do you see for government in doing this? Sort of playing devil's advocate. Well, that's what the market says. If you interfere, you'll mess things up. Is it through subsidies? Is it at the federal level? Is it by providing regional public goods? Or how do you sort of help and not hinder from what is the role of government?
So actually, let me say something about both sets of questions, because the question about people, I would also say brings back the issue we were talking about with regard to immigration earlier. When you look at any of those industries, the question of skills in the workforce becomes really critical. And the US and North Carolina in particular, we've had a confluence of migration coming in from Mexico and Central America and migration coming in from Asia, different skill sets. So I think part of what's important on the people side is not just to see this in terms of consumers, but to see it in terms of workforce, see it in terms of skills, and trying to bring in the kinds of people that are important from a worker point of view, but also from an entrepreneurial point of view, because a lot of recent immigrants also turn out to have a high entrepreneurial input in terms of setting up new companies. So I think there is a real strong people dimension. We could get into that. In terms of Antonio's sort of two questions, in terms of the 2x2 that I showed for North Carolina, to me it's also similar to the 3-column diagram I showed you for Mexico. In each case, Mexico or North Carolina can prioritize industries in terms of different categories by technology or whatever. I think and then the question of which ones to aim for, which ones to target. When I was doing the North Carolina ones, in some ways, I think you start with the idea that economic diversification is actually a big plus. If you're in different types of industries, especially because they're going to be located in different parts of your country or your state, you want to have that diversification. So for North Carolina, I think at least in 3 of those 4 boxes, we ought to be having strong economic development programs, but they would be targeted differently depending on the kind of industry we're looking at. So in that case, I don't think, so the idea that yes, if you tried to go into aerospace, everybody can't go there, I think that's true, but that's exactly why when we look at, say, Mexico's aerospace industry, some parts of Mexico's aerospace industry are oriented to advanced manufacturing. Other parts are more labor-intensive parts supply. And yet another part of the industry could be R&D. So once we take a value chain or a full industry approach, we realize that you need a lot of different kinds of economic activities, some production-related, and a lot of them services-related. In fact, what you start to see increasingly now in economic development kind of schemas is a U-curve, or what they call a smile curve, where in the bottom part of the smile is production activities, and pre-production and post-production services, design, R&D, marketing, that's where the high-value, high-wage jobs are. So back to an earlier discussion, I think services and manufacturing or production-related services, that mix is absolutely critical. You can't have production without having good services linked to the production, and they reinforce each other. Role of government, really good question. One role of government is actually investment promotion. I know when Costa Rica brought in Intel. The president of Costa Rica goes to the president of Intel and says why it's important. And I think leadership at a government level really set a tone in terms of the kinds of firms, if you're just talking about role of foreign investment. That's important. People talked earlier today about regulatory harmonization. I think that's a huge plus. If you can actually harmonize standards so we don't have unnecessary transaction costs, I think that's a big thing that governments can do, but it requires government collaboration, and you can go for the low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of obvious kinds of standards. And then I don't think subsidies is so much the way to go per se, but I think targeting the kind of, the vision of the kind of economic development you want. And in Mexico, where there's been so much debate about export-oriented jobs that are just low-paying with no local linkages, that's not the kind of sustainable development. And so I think increasingly countries and states that are aiming to sort of become more developed realize that these linkages, local linkages, are really important. Government sets a tone for that to some degree. So I think there's a lot of things government can do, but in the end, firms are the ones that have to make the investment decisions. And one final thing, workforce development. I think in a lot of these industries, small, medium firms need to comply with certain standards, like in medical devices. Government can help subsidize getting the requirements or the certifications for smaller firms to allow them to get into the game. But that might be local government, not necessarily. And I think that's a real important distinction. What level of government plays a key role? And I'm sure that Gene has sort of seen that from the North Carolina angle, and we can think about it. And I think it's so hard to get national legislation through on a lot of these issues that local level government is actually probably where a lot of the action is in terms of what you can do.
Sure. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So I just wanted to maybe wrap up the session and the day with a quick anecdote, and then maybe one last call from our presenters. But just as a story to share, so prior to the event, I reached out to a company just to get some feedback from a company that's here in North Carolina that does a lot of trade with NAFTA countries, and what their feedback was on NAFTA and how it was helpful or not to them. And the company was Hanes Brands, so a very familiar company here in North Carolina. And he was very supportive of NAFTA. It has been great for their company. But he did say that there are challenges and that there are lessons to be learned. I think his primary area of concern was in enforcement, and that there was not consistent enforcement amongst the countries, and it was very difficult for companies to try to appeal any decisions. And in fact, coincidentally, he's in Canada this week trying to settle a NAFTA dispute. But so I wanted to kind of open that back up to Gene and Gary just for some final thoughts. And so as we look towards the next 20 years of NAFTA and these new trade agreements, the TTIP and the TPP that are coming through, what are some lessons learned that we can take away, and how can we make it better for companies here in North Carolina?
Sure. I think, communication is key, is that so many times things seem to come up and there's not been enough input from companies around, what the issues are for them, what they're facing. And so I think that making sure that our North Carolina companies understand some of the framework of these free trade agreements and can help them, negotiate and navigate them with the feds. The other thing I would say is, again, anecdotally, what we've seen in North Carolina is companies who probably would have not survived this downturn, not only survive, but grow via exports. And so we certainly saw, for example, when the free trade agreement was signed with Panama and Colombia, our numbers jumped dramatically there. And so for most of our companies, it's a real opportunity.
Thanks. I think Gene summed it up well, and I echo the things we heard earlier in the morning, too. I think that there are always winners and losers on opening borders and on free trade, but I think as long as if we use things like increasing education as a kind of tool for what we want to do in the state, and we also have open policies with regard to immigration, I think broadening these free trade agreements actually doesn't hurt us at all. We're trying to, in the state, we have to create a solid platform or foundation in terms of a vision towards diversified economic growth. And I think these other agreements actually serve us well.
Since I opened up the conference, I get to close it down. And I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers and all of our wonderful guests, and thank all the centers that participate and the governments for their support. And thank you for sitting here, those of you who are just came to